Hello, class. Today we're going to continue our lecture on strategy and strategic planning. And we're just going to talk about one concept. So it's going to be a pretty short lecture, but it's a very important one, and one that has been used since the 80s. And it was developed by one of the probably one of the greatest strategic planning thinking minds, Michael Porter. And he's a professor from Harvard University, and he considered one of the greatest thinkers in terms of strategy. And his name will come up in subsequent lectures too. But what we're going to talk about today is Porter's 5 competitive forces. So whether we're looking to start a new business or whether we're looking to get into a new line of business, there are certain things in the external environment that we need to examine to determine whether it's an attractive endeavor, whether it's something we think we're going to be able to do or not. And we also have to evaluate the attractiveness of this new prospect. And if it's not attractive, then we don't want to do it, right? Or we may try to, for lack of better terms, exploit some external factors that can help our business. And Porter's five forces analysis helps us to do that by better understanding the forces that are out there in the external environment. So let's talk about these five forces, and then talk about the degree of the force which would make entering a new business or starting a new business attractive or unattractive, and then how can we maybe exploit some of these forces. So the first one that we need to look at is the threat of a new entrance. The threat of a new entrance. And what that talks about is how cost prohibitive is it to enter into this new industry. So if I am into an industry and I'm doing something, how easy is it for a competitor to get into the industry, whether we're talking about cost or whether we're talking about technology, whether we're talking about just constructing the business, how easy is for another entrant to get into this market? So you might look at something like oil refining, right? It's very difficult to get into the oil refining business. There's a lot of legislation. There's a lot of costs associated. You need to build a refinery. You need to outsource oil. It's a very difficult industry to get into. So if I'm in that industry, the threat of a new entrant is very low. If I'm in the business consulting industry, the threat of a new entrant is very high because it's very little cost, as long as I have the requisite skills and education, right? So I need maybe some business cards, I need a computer system, and then I just need to go out and hit the pavement and try to drum up some business. So the threat of an entrant in that market is very high. Oil refinery, it's very low. The bargaining power of the suppliers. So if I have a business, I'm going to need supplies. And I want to get the best price possible for those supplies. So I really need to understand how much leverage or how much bargaining power does the supplier have. If there's a lot of bargaining power by the supplier, meaning I could dictate, not necessarily dictate prices, but I can get the best price possible and take the supplier maybe from here down to here, then the bargaining power of the supplier would be low. If the bargaining power of the supplier is high, then I'm not going to be able to do too much of the price. The price is going to be set, and that's all it is that I'm going to be able to. That's what I'm going to end up paying for the price. So, look at it this way: in my given industry, if I could bargain with the supplier and get the lowest price possible, it's a much more attractive industry. If the prices are set and there's very little room for negotiation for me getting my resources, then it's not such an attractive industry because I have no leverage there, no bargaining power. So bargaining power of the supplier is the second of Porter's forces. The next one is the bargaining power of the buyers. How much power does the buyer have in dictating what the price is of my product? If the buyer can negotiate a better price from me and has a high bargaining power, that makes my business less attractive. If the buyer cannot negotiate a lower price and doesn't have that leverage, then it makes it far more attractive for me. Let's take Apple Computer for example. buyers can't negotiate a price with Apple, and very little times will Apple lower their prices. So the bargaining power of the buyer is very low in terms of Apple computing. The auto industry, car dealerships, the power of the buyer is very high. The bargaining power of the buyer is very high because usually you can go in and you can negotiate a better deal for a car. The sticker price isn't usually what you're paying for the car. And the reason that is, specifically in the auto industry, is the amount of information that's now available to the buyer. When I was growing up, I didn't have the availability of information. I had to go from dealership to dealership and try to negotiate a deal. Now, with the advent of the internet and things like that, I can get as much information as possible. I can get the Blue Book values of the car. I can get a fax report that tells me, has the car been in any accidents? I can see how many owners the car had. There's a whole slew of information. And then I can compare it to other cars within a 200-mile radius to see what the best price is. Now I can go to the dealership and say, I can get the same car with similar miles for about $2,000 or $3,000 less if I'm willing to drive 30 miles, which I am, unless you want to match the price. So the bargaining power of the buyer is very high, which may not make that a very attractive industry to be in. The threat of substitute products or services. Can the consumer go somewhere else and get a product that can be used as a substitute product in lieu of mine? So if there are a lot of substitute products available, then it's not necessarily an attractive industry. If there aren't a lot of substitutions available, and I have a very unique product that cannot be substituted, then it becomes a much more attractive industry. The last one of Porter's 5 forces is the rivalry among competitors. And as you can imagine, if there's intense rivalry and there's a lot of competing forces, it's not necessarily attractive. Because what will happen is, eventually, if there's a lot of competitors in an industry, the only thing we're going to be able to compete upon is price. Unless I have some distinct competitive advantage, but that's not necessarily the case when there's a lot of competitors. So if there's a lot of competitors, it ultimately comes down to competing on price and who could stay in the game the longest until some of those other competitors fall out. That is not necessarily an attractive industry to be in because it's cutthroat and very stressful. If there's few competitors and the rivalry isn't as intense, then it becomes a very attractive industry to be within. So those are Porter's 5 competitive forces, or 5 force analysis. And what you do is you rank each one of these in the magnitude of where they stand, and that tells you again where, if this industry is something that's attractive, if I want to be into this new area. There's also things though that we could exploit in that area too. So if I could bargain with my suppliers and see that there's wiggle room in the prices that I'm paying, then that's something that I should try to exploit in the external environment. So again, a lot of times what Porter is saying is that it's this external environment that we should focus on when we're looking strategically. And there's other points of view when it comes to strategic planning that'll say, no, look internally to your organization, because that's where you're going to find your competitive advantage in human resources or some other area. Porter says, no, it's in that external environment that we need to look. We need to look at these 5 forces and we need to see, is this attractive, and what are some of those forces that we could exploit?